Welcome everyone to the British Library tonight. It's lovely to see you all here. Welcome everybody also viewing and listening online, wherever you are. I'm Rowley Keating. It's my great privilege to be Chief Executive here at the British Library. And it is lovely to be introducing the final part of the 39th, David, Panizzi lecture series here at the British Library, which I suspect many of you do know, but it's a big part of our annual events calendar here, held in honor of the great Antonio Panizzi, who back in the 19th century set so much of the culture, so many of the standards for the institution we still run today through the inheritance from the British Museum Library. And it is held around every year different aspects of themes around advancing knowledge and understanding of the history of the book. And tonight, of course, I am delighted that we are introducing, for the third time in the sequence, Elizabeth McHenry, Professor of English at New York University, for the third and final lecture in her series, Black Bibliography, Here and Now. And I'm sure many of you know a little bit about Elizabeth's research and background. She focuses on Black intellectual history, particularly the history of Black print culture in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Among her books are Forgotten Readers, about the lost history of African American literary societies, and more recently, To Make Negro Literature, Writing, Literary Practice, and African American Authorship. In this lecture series, the themes have been revolving around the history of Black print and the meaning and definitions of even the term Black bibliography. In the first lecture was called In Search of Black Readers, and Elizabeth explained something about her understanding of the concept of lostness of Black history, but also exploring the ways in which voices and history can be recovered and made legible through what does remain, the traces and tracks that are there in the record. In the second lecture, Thinking Bibliographically, Elizabeth considered the history of Black bibliography alongside questions around its critical, potential, and indeed future directions. The title of tonight's talk is Spaces of Black Study, and I'm going to let Elizabeth set the scene for that, and instead I'm going to talk very practically about things like fire alarms. In other words, if in the room here you hear one, it will be a real one, so please take it seriously. I'm going to ask everyone in the room to make sure your phone is at least on silent, if not turned off completely or even left at home. And towards the end of the lecture, as usual, we will create an opportunity for questions. Please do contribute to that if you're inspired and provoked and stimulated by what you've heard. We'll have a roving microphone in the room. And if you're at home and watching on our video platform, you'll see, I think, a little box underneath, and you'll need to minimize the main screen in order to write your question in there. But we will try and track those, and Katrina will keep track of what's coming in. I think that is it from me. Like you, I'm looking forward to the lecture, so please let me welcome to the stage Elizabeth McHenry.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone in this room. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in through Zoom or whatever platform is being used. I'm thrilled to be here, and I just want to extend a real thanks to everyone at the British Library and the Panizzi Council for having me. It's been just a wonderful last 3 lectures and time in London. And now I'm a little disappointed that it's coming to an end, but we'll make it the best end we can do it. So let me get started. In their seminal article, What's Black About Black Bibliography, Jackie Goldsby and Meredith McGill gestured toward both the complexity of Black bibliography and its vibrant future. They argue that what's distinctive about Black bibliography is its practitioners' awareness of the conditions and traditions that have shaped Black print, Black archives, and the cultural and institutional efforts to preserve them. Black bibliography can be written by all scholars, they contend, if they are mindful of a set of principles. In their ordering, the first of these is Black print culture's expansive scope. Although their own project is focused on Black print cultures in the US, they recognize that the Black in Black bibliography is a polyvalent term. Black print cultures exist throughout the diaspora, each with their own genealogies, languages, physical formats, modes of publication, distribution, and circulation. Gouldsby and McGill recognize that essential scholarship that analyzes the complex histories manifest in those print materials' physical forms has been done and is ongoing. To use the term Black, then, and to think about Black bibliography signals that multiple histories of print production, transmission, and consumption await to be aligned and reconciled, not into a seamless, homogenous field of inquiry, but mapped as what they describe as a constellation of relational possibilities. So what will it take to see these relational possibilities? More than anything else, mapping Black print across the diaspora will simply require more exploratory studies. Growing interest in Black print culture studies and Black bibliography notwithstanding, we simply need more such work. We've only begun to scratch the surface of what we know about and how we approach the history of Black print, and to learn more and see it anew, to situate Black print in different registers and at different conjunctions, we need to encourage our colleagues and train our students to extend their work in ways that pressure our nationalist paradigms and the barriers of geography, language, and time. Simply put, only by generating more lenses through which to see Black print and to experiment with different ways of studying, interpreting, contextualizing, and understanding it, will we be able to see emerging patterns. This may require us to broaden our purview and to step outside of what we think of as our scholarly comfort zone. My talk tonight is the tentative beginning of my own effort to do that, at the beginning of which is an admission of how little I know about global Black history and culture. It's been incredibly rewarding for me to learn more about Black British history and the history of its print culture. But the more I learn, the more afraid I am that I will never know enough to write about it in authoritative ways. There's no doubt in my mind that Britain and London in particular hold what Kevin Gaines has described as a rich and integral place in the Black world, and this is reflected in its print culture. Reinforced by mass migration from British colonies and former colonies in the Caribbean, Africa, and South Asia in the mid-20th century, Britain has always been a strategic location as a site of overlapping African diasporas, as well as what Claude McKay, writing about the time he spent living in London between 1919 and 1921, called radical knowledge. This history is hardly simple. What I found is very much in keeping with what Adam Cooper Elliott notes in his retrospective essay on the journal Race Today, one of the periodicals located at the center of the history of Black print culture. The multiple routes which led British colonial subjects to the mother country are separated by oceans or colonial borders, as well as histories, cultures, and experiences. Thus, he writes, it is near impossible to present a straightforward narrative, a Black narrative in Britain. Cooper Elliott points to the intellectual challenges of this, which include the propensity to fall back on the relative ease of what he calls preordained Black historical epochs, like the US civil rights movement or campaigns against apartheid in South Africa. There is certainly a common narrative to be found in standing up to racism, or in the kinds of leadership that emerged in these movements. But as Cooper Elliott notes, neither of these stories reflects the routes Black people in Britain have made from colony to imperial center. What's more, the result of trying to relate to everyone is a simplified narrative that doesn't really speak to Black Britain's multiple and overlapping histories. I've become increasingly sensitive to this as I ventured into thinking about Black British print cultures and how we might begin to map patterns of Black print across time, generations, geographic space, and national borders. What has become most apparent to me is the abundance of textual materials that are available to study Black British print culture and how much there is to learn from them. I'm humbled and awed and just a little bit envious of the stunning array of texts that have resulted from politically deliberate and purposefully activist efforts to gather and preserve Black print, which are evident in the rich collections that exist in and alongside the British Library. The result is a partnership that includes the George Padmore Institute, the Black Cultural Archives, and the Huntley Archives and the Black History Collection at the London Archives, as well as a wealth of local, community-based Black history projects, collectives, and repositories. All these collections make vital contributions to the common project of properly recognizing the place and importance of race and print in Black British historical experience and in the history of the Black diaspora. Quite literally, these archives will change how British history is written and explained by future generations of scholars and teachers. Even the culture of collecting itself, which has led to such archival abundance, is rich with potential for more scholarly attention. The work of Black bibliophiles, collectors, archivists, and librarians illuminates the documentary impulse in Black history, as well as the radical lengths to which some went to collect Black books, manuscripts, and ephemera. Len Garrison's explanation of how he began building the Black Cultural Archives suggests the breadth of what's included in that collection, as well as the logic of his own collecting practice. Anywhere I went, he notes, I used to cut out articles in newspapers. I would just collect them. But eventually I began to build up a collection by going to the antique shops, to Portobello Road, and to secondhand shops. Garrison's Anywhere I Went is important because it suggests the fugitivity of Black print, as well as his own emerging intellectual practice for finding and materially recovering it, which for Garrison included dismantling Black print to salvage certain bits of it and scouring used bookstores and antiquarian markets for rare finds. Also important is exactly what Garrison was looking for in his print hunting rambles, which speaks to the critical inquiry at the heart of collecting. What should a Black archive be comprised of? What counts? What deserves to be recorded? What's significant? For Garrison, the answer to these questions was anything that had a life within the community that would counter the erasure of Black Britons from dominant political memorializations of the British past. His collecting practice, then, makes visible two important things. The first is an activist agenda. The Black Archive is an inherently political space and a future-oriented one, meant to preserve the Black past in order to write the historical record. The second is about the imperative of respecting what the Black Archive includes, whatever that turns out to be. Those texts that have had a life within Black communities tend toward what Walter Benjamin calls the hidden spindles and joints of print culture in the literary world, taking the form of things like newspaper clippings, pamphlets, leaflets, flyers, campaign materials, and journals. That's not to say that they don't include books, because they do. But these other forms are, in Benjamin's words, those inconspicuous forms that fit their influence in active communities better than does the pretentious universal gesture of the book. The prompt language of these forms, Benjamin noted, shows itself actively equal to the moment. If, as Brett Edwards has argued, diaspora is something practiced, then the practice of diaspora was, and perhaps still is, located in these so-called minor nodes of print culture, which were produced and exchanged among both Black intellectuals and the Black public. Traditionally considered lower and lower in quotes, and more ephemeral than books, these print forms were crucial to making Blackness understood as a sort of axis, the strength of which went beyond language, nation, and even race. Documents of this sort were particularly relevant in Britain in the 1970s, where the space of print was mobilized to scrutinize knowledge and propose new ways of seeing and knowing, to tilt the world, so to speak, towards blackness. What follows is decidedly exploratory, and it begins, at least it began for me, with this arresting illustration of a divided person and imagined bookshelf. What is so instructive about this image from a 1971 issue of the community newspaper Grassroots is the way it makes visible a larger story about the complexity of print, its weight and its ability to injure, as well as its potential to make something new. In her study of Black collecting practices in the 20th century US, Laura Helton has called Black print both equipment for struggle and an invitation to a future that sees Blackness otherwise. In this lecture, I consider both of those capacities by looking closely at two key spaces of Black print from Britain in the 1970s. The first is this imagined bookshelf. And I will contextualize the bookshelf depicted in this illustration alongside another Black bookshelf from an earlier period in the US to see how vexing texts have historically been for Black people, as well as how curated bookshelves have been mobilized to recast the unbreakable link between Blackness and textuality. The second space I look at is the space created for textual preservation in the pages of the journal Race Today, a journal initially published by the Institute of Race Relations before being taken over and pushed in a significantly less academic and more radical direction by the Race Today Collective in 1974. Race Today and its leadership team has been carefully studied from a number of perspectives, and I won't repeat that work. What I wish to add to these studies is a granular look at the way the journal concerned itself with text and print, collecting, reproducing, and resituating it in a way that demanded its readers confront, hold, and sit with even the most injurious texts. I want to see how Race Today activated archival practice and textual assemblage as a pedagogical and tactical strategy of viewership and historical negotiation, deliberately and insistently making racist text visible in order to make the relationship between what exists in different registers of print stand on the same plane. I'll explore the journal's power to challenge dominant narratives and foster alternative ways of knowing. Inherent in both parts of this lecture is the question, what does it mean to inhabit the spaces of Black print? My proposal is that we think of these textual spaces, or spaces defined by texts, like collections of books on bookshelves or the architectural space of periodicals, as critical spaces for Black study. I borrow this term from Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, who define Black study as intellectual work that takes place outside of the constraints of formal institutions. Black study is a practice of thinking, learning, and imagining that often happens through the space of texts, a bookshelf filled with Black-authored texts, or a journal that purposely juxtaposes diverse voices and perspectives. Black study is not Black studies. If Black studies is a formal interdisciplinary academic field focused on the history, culture, and politics of the Black diaspora that found its way into the university in the 1960s, Black study is a mode of thinking and learning that is not embedded in the university or in traditional academic settings. It's not tethered to trained intellectuals, and it existed long before the institutionalization of the field of Black studies. Black study is a way of being and thinking with others that operates outside of the mainstream. The spaces where Black study takes shape and happens, everyday spaces and social settings that Harney and Moten call the undercommons, are spaces where all people can engage in the intellectual practice of knowledge production on their own terms, rather than on terms established by academic structures. These are community spaces of both learning and unlearning, of collaborative resistance and future planning. The point of study, Moten and Harney write, is not to produce knowledge, but to produce a relation. In other words, the purpose of Black study is not to accumulate facts or expertise, though this is one of the things that happens, but to build relationships between people, texts, ideas, and histories. It is through these relations that new possibilities for liberation and transformation emerge. It arms its students with the tools needed to move beyond what is to imagine what might be. Historically, texts have been a site of deep tension for Black people, one with which they are inextricably bound. Saidiya Hartman has written in the starkest terms about the power of texts and the systems of knowledge they represent to deny humanity, particularly when published in authoritative forms such as school books or textbooks, and therefore seen and considered as official sources of knowledge. In her 2019 essay, The Plot of Her Undoing, Hartman catalogs the various plots, and by plots she means systems, causes, plans, ways of organizing the world that have led to Black undoing. Her sentences in this essay slip among centuries as she chronicles real and connected historical events that have been inflicted on a historical her. All of them linked to the rise of slavery, colonization, modernity, and the violence that persists as their ongoing effects. The plot of her undoing, she writes, begins in the 15th century with a philosopher at his desk, pen in hand, as he sorts the world into categories of genus and species. It begins with a bill of sale, with a story in a newspaper that enumerates her crimes, with a note appended to the file. She answers questions easily, but appears stupid. The plot of her undoing begins with a man in his study writing a tome of the Americas, the species, the fauna, the races. It is a compendium illustrated with botanical drawings, architectural plans, sketches of farm buildings, and a microscopic view of her scarf skin. Given its ubiquity, Hartman seems to wonder, how could the plot be undone? It is only at the very end of the essay that Hartman inverts the construction that has structured her text to this point, the plot of her undoing, to reflect on its opposite, the undoing of the plot. In this part of the essay, she offers escape routes and moments of resistance, both major and minor. The undoing of the plot proceeds by stealth, she writes. It's almost never recognized as anything at all, certainly never as significant. This image effectively visualizes both print's capacity for Black undoing, as well as its possibilities as a site of resistance. Grassroots was a newspaper published for Britain's Black population by the Black Liberation Front, a London-based organization committed to liberation struggles of Black people across the globe. It is one of the many that Rob Waters reads beautifully in his brilliant study, Thinking Black, Black Britain, 1964 to 1985, and my reading of it substantially follows his. As Waters describes it, the picture, and I quote, distills the promise of reading into an image of a man of African descent, literally split in two, between an almost white self and a Black self. As Waters notes, his very transition into Blackness is marked on the man's body in his clothes, from a suit to a dashiki, stance, from stiff detachment to a relaxed, easy relationship with his environment, and hair, from close-cropped to long, quote-unquote, natural, and from clean-shaven to bearded. The difference is captured in the bookshelf. These differences are captured also in the bookshelves on either side of the man, each, as Waters notes, representing the two stores of knowledge upon which whiteness and Blackness were seen to rest. So the books on the left, what we might call the white side, of the bookshelf are classics of British literature, including a volume of Shakespeare, a work by or about Churchill, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. On the right, or the black side, we find an entirely different collection of texts, including a history of Africa and some classics of the Black Power movement. Atop this shelf sits an issue of the grassroots newspaper itself, reinforcing its position as a tool of Black intellectual engagement. Below the image is a caption that reads, "One time my eyes were shadowed and I couldn't see the light, but now the veil's lifted, I can take the course that's right." It's a powerful statement, repurposing a biblical phrase to suggest that liberation begins with seeing the truth that is accessed, in this case, through books. This illustration strikes me as both painfully contradictory and rich with meaning. It animates the tension between systems of knowledge as well as how this shapes identity, making visible what W.E.B. Du Bois, writing at the beginning of the 20th century, described as double consciousness, the sense of being split between two competing identities, two different epistemologies, two visions of the world. But the image also offers the possibility of something transformative, a different way of knowing and understanding oneself and the world. Here, the bookshelf on the right, with its collection of texts which challenge the logic of colonialism, white supremacy, and assimilation, becomes a pathway to Black study. It isn't a rejection of the Western canon, but an invitation to reorient oneself around texts that affirm Black histories, cultures, and futures. The image also captures the power of a shelf of books. As mundane as a bookshelf populated with texts may seem, it's never neutral. It tells a story of priorities, exclusions, and aspirations. In this case, it tells us about the struggle inherent in thinking critically, in unlearning dominant narratives, and in reordering the texts that define us. For me, it's helpful to think about the grassroots bookshelf along the example of a similar one, in this case, a real-life Black bookshelf from a different context. In 1925, Mary White Ovington, a white journalist, social worker, and the co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, wrote a piece for the journal Publishers Weekly titled "Selling Race Pride." And the article was about Catherine Magnolia Johnson, a Black woman who was a former teacher and an experienced political organizer. In the article, Ovington chronicled Johnson's decision to become an itinerant bookseller who traveled throughout the North and Southeastern United States, selling a selection of books by and about African Americans out of her car. And this image is interesting. I'm not sure where it popped up, but I've been working with Mary White, with Katherine Johnson for a long time, and I had never seen this image until the last few weeks. So I have more research to do, even in figuring out, where it came from. But it is an image of her with the Model T, and so you can see how she set up the books at the front as part of this project of sort of itineracy. So she called it her 2-foot bookshelf. 2 feet of books, she explained to her buyers, that you and all the colored people might read. Johnson's sales trips, during which she regularly sought out and received permission to address congregations of local churches, sheds light on one of the ways in which literature was distributed in Black communities in the US in the first decades of the 20th century. Equally important is her understanding of her mission. I am, first of all, not selling books, Johnson explained. I'm, first of all, creating a desire for reading. I knew the books that would help the Negro to understand his honorable place in the United States. The question was how to get him to buy them. I knew the man or woman must handle the book, see what was in it, before he would put money down for it. So I bought my Ford and became an itinerant bookseller. In an unpublished autobiography, Johnson lingers over a specific incident remembered from her childhood that for her indelibly linked a direct confrontation with racism to books. First, a white classmate called her by a racial slur. Soon after that, she experienced what she called an even worse affront when reading what she described as one of the very textbooks which we were given to study and accept as infallible. As she remembered it, the very size of the book was one element of the weight of the incident. Called eclectic geography, it was, and she says, it was the largest book we had, taking up most of the space on the desk. One section of the book was given over to a discussion of the races of mankind, she writes. There were pictures of each race. All had been given fairly intelligent faces except the black man. Underneath his picture was this caption: "This is an Ethiopian. He belongs to the most inferior race on the globe." I was amazed, Johnson wrote, stunned. My schoolmates turned to me and said, "That's your folks." I was crushed. For Johnson, it was not the name-calling that activated her drive to fight back. It was the disorientation and the pain caused by the textbook that drove her to take up the tools of Black study as a proactive method of rejecting the perception of inferiority it authoritatively projected. I began to think about it, she wrote in her autobiography. I began to look in other books. No matter where she looked, she saw no book which gave the African or the American colored man credit for any accomplishment. So Johnson's study of what and how we come to know led her to realize that textbook authors and publishers were part of what she called a conspiracy designed to create a feeling of inferiority among all peoples in whose vein there ran the blood of Africa. The workings of this conspiracy took two forms, she observed. The first was active. It sought, as did my public school eclectic geography, to degrade the Negro as a race. The other form of this conspiracy, she says, was a silent one. It sought to exclude the Negro as a race. This should not be, Johnson said. Textbooks should contain the facts. History books should speak the truth. If there had been great men of color, scientists, inventors, scholars, military men, these things should be made known, especially to the colored people themselves. For how can a race live with pride? How can an individual breathe with self-esteem if his race, his people, have all been nobodies? Johnson's 2-foot shelf of books that she says all the colored people ought to read is a response to both the accusation of nothingness and the need to live with pride. As what the scholar Jane Carr has called a curator with political intent, Johnson actively researched, compiled, circulated, and revised bookshelves of reading material. Her literary provocation an effort to undo the plot laid in textbooks and other forms of print that work to denigrate Black people. So as a historical point of connection, the story of Johnson's 2-foot bookshelf helps add depth to our reading of the great grassroots bookshelf from 1971 by showing how a collection of texts shapes what's possible to know. If the set of books from the British and Anglo-American canon on the left aren't right for Black people, it is because their perspective, alongside the social and cultural values and priorities that go with them, like accumulating wealth and expertise at golf, contribute to the impression that, in Johnson's words, Black people have all been, quote unquote, nobodies. The texts gathered on the right unsettle the ones on the left, centering and legitimizing the Black ways of knowing and insisting that Black people need to critique and reorder the very texts through which they know themselves and by which they have been known. The implication is that thinking with, critiquing, and imagining across this body of Black texts offers the possibility of different ways of seeing and a different set of priorities as well. These include working for the betterment of your community as an alternative to corporate ambition and professionalism, loving and valuing yourself and those who support you, and knowing and embracing your racial and cultural heritage. The print culture of Black Britain in the 1970s is overflowing with examples that attest to the way that print was used to purposely evoke and sustain Black study and to provoke the kind of struggle visible in this illustration. In addition to publishing Grassroots, the Black Liberation Front established 3 bookshops across North and Northwest London, which not only supplied the Black community with reading material, but also became hubs for information, events, and community support. Their Head Start bookshop on West Green Road housed a supplementary school for young people, where a team of volunteers taught math, English, and Black history on weekends. Much of the effort to build Black community centers that could house Black print and make it available was marshaled to counter the inadequate education provided to Black children. But the movement recognized that all Black people, regardless of age, needed access to appropriate print. The periodical Race Today addressed this in a special supplement included in their October-November 1973 issue, which featured a set of images from Enid Blyton's 1937 The Little Black Doll on its cover. This kind of story about a Black doll that is only lovable after the rain had washed away its quote-unquote ugly Black face perfectly illustrates and illustrated why Black people in Britain needed access to different kinds of texts. It is impossible to overestimate the influence books have on the lives of us all, the special supplement began. Speaking to the weight of texts and their far-reaching impact, it continued. They inform us when we learn at school, as they inform the teachers who teach us and the lecturers who taught them. They inform the journalists who prepare the television programs we watch at night or the newspapers we read in the morning. They are the reference source for the politicians and pundits, for leaders and those who would overthrow them. Between their covers are stored much of our knowledge, our culture, and our very ways of thinking. So you might wonder why the editors of Race Today chose to use images from Blyton's The Little Black Doll on the cover of the journal. It was clearly one of the racist books that they wished to criticize, but did they need to do so by positioning it in a place of prominence and exposing their readers directly to its hurtful images? In the pages of this periodical, the answer was always yes. Race Today printed even the most racist, injurious texts as a way of demanding that its readers see them, hold them, and wrestle with them, and then also wrestle with what it meant to wrestle with them. From about 1973 on, the journal's aim was to be a repository for the entire print record that pertained to race and racism. It did this relentlessly and in a variety of ways, most of which are visible in the special supplement on books, libraries, and racism. It includes an annotated bibliography of the standard literature on race relations. Guys, I'm behind one slide, I'm sorry. So let me just fill you in really quickly. This is the beginning of the special supplement. And for those of you, especially in the library profession, it's an incredible just few pages of background on the state of library service and the kinds of requests that the Black community made in terms of broadening both service and the content, the texts of the library. And what I'm about to talk about is this image. Sorry, now I'm really messed up. Is this image, which is from a bibliography that is embedded in that special supplement. Let me just go back a sentence or two. From about 1973 on, the journal's aim was to be a repository for the entire print record that pertained to race and racism. It did this relentlessly and in a variety of ways, most of which are visible in the special supplement on books, libraries, and racism. It included an annotated bibliography, which is what you see in front of you, of the standard literature on race relations, which stands out for the way it demonstrates Race Today's textual strategy. The annotations are particularly telling because they distinguish in the most direct and straightforward terms between texts that are excellent or essential reading and those publications deemed rubbish and hopelessly outdated or misinformed and misguided. Including all of these references in the bibliography insisted on the importance of knowing all of these publications, which spoke in different registers to the bibliography's title, Books That Are Dangerous. As the annotations attest, books could be dangerous in a host of different ways. The array of texts presented underscores the multiple kinds of danger with which these books flirt. Some are dangerous because of their outdated, wrong-headed, or misguided perspectives, while others are perceived as dangerous because of the powerful, frank consideration and analysis of race relations that they offer. A single line on an advertisement for the Institute of Racial Relations Library, which is published in the same issue of Race Today, captures the reason the journal worked so hard to make this range of texts visible. To know where you are and where you're going, you must know yourself, your allies, and your enemies, it reads. The way Race Today arranged text on the page demanded that readers see and consider all of what the record contained, the misinformed and misguided alongside what was serviceable or even excellent. This meant reprinting even the most painful words and images to make visible in full the texts that carried them. It was a pedagogical and tactical strategy used to inspire readers to make their own determination of what texts meant, including those that sat next to each other on the page. When the editor of a journal called Assistant Librarian wrote to complain about the way librarians and the field of library science had been depicted in Race Today's special supplement on books, libraries, and racism, for instance, Race Today printed the letter in a subsequent issue. Assistant Librarian was a journal aimed at young practicing librarians, and its editor complained that Race Today had been excessively critical of the journal's comic strip called Alabam, a regular feature about a young Black librarian. The Race Today supplement had singled it out as evidence of what it called racism and sexism masked as trendy liberalism. The original article had merely mentioned the offensive comic and its main character in passing, describing her as a young Black librarian crudely drawn as a female gollywog figure, who was usually depicted in a state of undress. That's how Race Today described it, the comic strip. When challenged by the editor of the journal Assistant Librarian, Race Today printed a panel from the offensive comic so readers could see it. Making the panel visible to its readers only supported Race Today's claim about and I'm quoting here, the crass insensitivity of the library professional to the Black community and its inability to think in anything but the stereotypes of the white society. And you'll see this is the close-up of the previous image. This is a panel from the comic Alabam. I'm sorry, the text is not visible, but it's certainly worth going back and looking at the comic strip. And I think there's a whole dissertation to be written probably on that comic strip alone and comic strips generally. So the Alabam comic panel did not include a caption, nor did Race Today mount any sort of verbal response to the editor's letter. They simply placed the texts in proximity to one another as a way of insisting that Black study demanded that readers engage in the difficult and sometimes painful work of reckoning with all that appeared in print, including that which was painful and insulting. This is not to say that the journal effectively neutralized those texts. It did not. Rather, Race Today's compositional principle insisted that readers actively engage with what was celebratory, along with what was most distressing, collecting those texts into an archive its readers were likely to have wanted to embrace one moment, and then wanted to throw against the wall the next. One can only imagine what an exhausting textual space this was, but it was a generative one as well, because it inspired deep thinking and further learning. Race Today gave its readers the responsibility of fully engaging with the texts of their undoing, recognizing that they were the very texts that demanded attention. The reason for this is because these texts and their effects were lasting, and they would only continue to inflict damage. One Race Today writer made this clear in no uncertain terms, and this is also from the same supplement, saying, "The bullshit that people write lives after them. Shakespeare, Blake, Carlyle, Macaulay, Kipling, Orwell, Eliot, Foster, Burton, Little Black Sambo Woman," I forget her name, "and countless others have formed the racist mind and the culture of imperialism." So perhaps the best example of Race Today's textual strategy is found in the way that it documented the violence against Black bookstores that erupted in London and eventually spread to other parts of Britain. And this was in the 1977 and 1978. When the Bogle bookstore was vandalized in February of 1977, Race Today included, in the same month's issue, a full-page announcement of the attack. The page includes 4 parts. The first, extracts from the leaflet left behind by the racist, and that's their term. The second, the image that appeared on the leaflet. The third, the press statement issued by the bookstore. And the fourth, an advertisement for the bookshop that was attacked and included its address and the invitation, "Come and visit us." There's no tidy narrative to be had here, nor are there any editorial comments to soften the blow of the events or of this image. The only quote-unquote explanation that is given in the press release is this, and it simply states, the Bogle Louverture publication, so the publication arm of the bookstore, has been providing services to libraries, schools, teacher training colleges, curriculum development centers, and teacher resource centers throughout Britain. It's one of the few bookshops in the country where the Black community can find literature and writings from Africa, Afro-America, Asia, and the Caribbean. This factuality is repeated in the way that Race Today documents the attack a few pages later in an account which details each meeting with the police and updates in the weeks and months after it. Bookshops would continue to be the subject of racial violence throughout 1977 and well into 1978, and Race Today reported on this violence, including ensuring that its readers knew that this violence against bookshops was spreading throughout the country. So the historian of the Black radical tradition, Robin D.G. Kelley, has written about a scrap of paper he keeps taped to the inside of his desk drawer with 3 words scrawled across it: love, study, struggle. He describes these words as serving as a daily reminder of what he is supposed to be doing. Black study and resistance, he writes, must begin with loving ourselves as Black people. To love this way requires relentless struggle, deep study, and critique. Kelley talks about the need for Black people to, and I quote, go to the root in their study, by which he means that Black study must attend to the historical, political, social, cultural, ideological, material, and economic root of oppression in order to understand its negation, which he terms the prospect of our liberation. This sort of rigorous study and struggle is, he says, the only way to illuminate what's hidden from us, largely because most structures of oppression and all of their various entanglements are simply not visible and not felt. What Kelly is speaking to here is the importance of facing and deeply understanding the Black past, which must be both seen and felt. Rhoda Boateng, a London-based archivist and writer, put this in a slightly different way. Writing about her experience working in in Britain's Black cultural archives, first as a volunteer, then as an archivist in training, and finally as an archive supervisor, Boateng referred to the tension that is always at play when she looks at the documents of Black history. I try to sit with what doesn't sit well with me, she says. What Boateng describes here is the discomfort that I suspect most of you felt as you viewed some of my images, which is a necessary part of engaging with the Black past and the materials of Black print culture. There is no substitute for sitting with these materials, as this is a crucial part of knowing how to approach them, how to learn from them. As Boateng says of her own work, only by sitting with what does not sit well with her can she rethink and reimagine the role of the archivist and archival spaces. We might think about Race Today, and indeed the illustration of the Black bookshelf from the journal Grassroots, with which I began this lecture, as purposefully engendering a similar trajectory of both feeling and thinking and reimagining, giving each of the journal's readers a way to approach and to sit with the very texts that surely did not sit well with them. These sorts of concrete intellectual confrontations, which are facilitated in the textual spaces of Black study, make it possible to critique and challenge the myths of our society, to perceive its realities more clearly, and to find alternatives and new directions for action. This may well be one of the most important constellations to take shape in the history of Black print across the Black diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think we're going to maybe stand by the podium and take a few questions. We've got maybe 10 minutes or so at least. So we have a roving mic in the room. Katrina, I'll keep an eye out for you if anyone at home wants to press that question button underneath. But yes, does anyone, I can see a hand up there. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm really interested in hearing more about your reflections kind of from the outsider perspective into Black bibliography as it may be being practiced in the UK, and particularly about with the state of what you find, but also the legibility of this word bibliography. Because it seems like it's being practiced, but the word bibliography isn't being kind of used or invoked. And I think what's great about what you just did is you set out the possibilities of thinking in those terms. So what do you find when you come to this field? Thank you.
So it's interesting because bibliography is not my first choice of words, and it took a long time for me to realize or to think of what I was doing, and I still, I think, stumble over thinking of what I do as bibliography. I'm much more comfortable with thinking that I study Black print, and so in some ways, I think one thing that is ongoing, in other words, that we're in the midst of, is a moment where people are having a newfound appreciation for the practice of bibliography, which is merging in a really nice way with the vibrancy of both print culture studies, and I don't mean only Black print culture studies, I mean the expansiveness and the vibrancy of print culture studies and book history studies. It would be interesting, and in fact, I mean, I think many of us are sort of standing examples of that trajectory, probably from this realization of the history of the book, which of course had been practiced in Europe well before it got to the United States, and became, sort of a vibrant scholarly practice. And the way that, for instance, the way that I gravitated towards print culture studies, and again, the jury is out for me about whether I will feel like and sort of continue to carry a torch for bibliography per se. But one thing that's interesting is the way that a history of bibliography and a newfound, I think, again, appreciation for something that I feel like in the last little bit has not been really appreciated, at least in the U.S. It's not taught. It's not appreciated in the same way. So, to gain a greater appreciation for it and kind of fumble about for its usefulness, I think is what I would say is going on. And again, I think you're absolutely right. Print culture studies, these are all going on. And again, we're merging terms here in ways that I think we will only see the fruitfulness of in the future as we sort of continue to muddle through what's useful about returning to or thinking of ourselves in the context of bibliography. Like, here's what's going to happen. How does it feel? Is it useful? Does it get me somewhere that I wasn't getting to with, for me, print culture definitely got me somewhere that I wasn't getting at with history of the book. Even by thinking about books expansively, not only as books, but as print textual objects. And I'm clearer on that than what I'm going to get from bibliography right now, if I'm being totally honest. But I think it's interesting to think about, to go back and think about, well, what might we study differently, or or even, for me, I started only because I was studying bibliographies, and all of a sudden I realized I was studying bibliographies, and around me, bibliography was something being returned to, and so that's how I come at it. The question is, will it be useful, as we move forward?
Thank you. Any other hands up or questions or thoughts in the room? Yes, over there. Quite right. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I found it really stimulating and revolutionary in a way for my thinking. But my question would be, what is your opinion on how much of what you study as print culture or bibliography can be expanded in terms of methodology or any other methods, really, to other studies of print culture of other groups, minority, not necessarily minority, but just, groups. Thank you.
So one way I'd answer that is thinking about what we prioritize. One of the things that I have, my last book, which I didn't talk very much about, but it was on failure. It was on projects, literary projects that failed, people that never found their work into publication. So it was really about, it was about thinking about what objects we study when we say we're studying, literature. Do we only study those things that are published? I think that these methodologies, for instance, just even thinking about, the principles of Black bibliography that I've laid out, my own sense is that they help us think contextually, and so come at works of literature not broadly and generally, but more granularly and with more attention to the kinds of contexts in which the work was written, how it has been valued over time, how it has been handled, that we think with greater degrees of specificity. That's like that's not a super complicated observation, but I do think that that is what, thinking about what is queer bibliography, what is Black bibliography, what is feminist bibliography. It is about thinking in ways that in the past we haven't thought, or thinking with sensitivities and specificities that we haven't always brought to the material.
Thank you. Any other hands up or questions in the room? Yes, sir.
Thank you. First, just thank you for 3 really brilliant lectures. It's been terrific to be here. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about the place you ended. The Boateng quote about sitting with the things. I try to sit with what doesn't sit well with me. And if I understood you correctly, there was kind of a provocation at the end of the talk today and in this lecture where you were focusing on the fact that the Black bibliographic imagination has had an interest in images of offense as much as in things that are supportive of Black culture. And in a context where content warnings and trigger warnings have become so much a question, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about what it means to kind of insist on the necessity of a Black bibliography that attends to these images as well as to other materials as well.
That's such a good question. And I will say that I thought, we're in a changing, at least in the United States, in the context of my own students, we're in I work with a generation who is very sensitive to what they see, and trigger warnings are, when I say new to me, I mean, it wasn't something I grew up with, certainly. And it's interesting as a scholar that works with material that is certainly, triggering, to say the least. I mean, that is very sensitive. It's interesting to think about, well, what you can't say and what you can't know. And it used to be that I would just plunge ahead because I felt myself that there were words that need to be said and there were images that needed to be projected. So it's interesting because my language, the words that I'm willing to say, has been withdrawn. I've taken it back in the classroom. I've taken it back way. In terms of images, I think that we can all think back to the images that are the hardest to see and that are also sometimes the most important for us to see. My son just wrote a paper and he was talking about Emmett Till. Emmett Till is the young boy, 14 years old, was from the North, went down to the South to visit relatives, and allegedly whistled at a woman, a white woman, and was brutally beaten, and then his body submerged in water, and his mother insisted that his casket be open. And so that was a huge moment, because what she insisted on was that people see what had happened to her son. And I think in some ways it's always difficult to know, how much you insist that people see what you're talking about and see the kinds of images, for instance, in terms of what I've been working with, the kinds of images that were posted, around London, around the United States, because they're horrible, right? They're horrific, and yet it is almost, for me, I feel as if, I feel a little bit as if what I'm arguing that Race Today did, that they insisted you have to see them, right? Because you have to be able to sort of think deeply about them, and you have to understand them, and you have to, when I say respond, I don't mean physical response or immediate response, but I mean you have to live with them, because that is part of the landscape in which you live. And I think that I talk a lot with my students. I talk a lot about critical thinking, right? And critical thinking is, of course, what in the humanities, we teach critical thinking. But critical thinking is being able to see the whole array and to make understandings from it. And if you haven't seen the whole array, it's hard to make those understandings. And remember that those understandings they're emotive. I mean, they're emotional as well as intellectual. So anyway, I don't know that I have it right, but I think if I were to make an argument, it would be for the importance of sitting with it. That's what, I was talking to someone, this is what we do in the archives. I mean, when we find this material, we sit with it. And that is how we come to understand the moment that we're writing about, or how to read it in the present. And that's, in some ways, that's what history is about, right? Writing history. It is about that project of sitting with the past and bringing your own understanding to this present day. And I think my sense is that that it's best done in the presence of the material.
I think we've got another question, just a row in front there, along there. Thank you. Keep an eye on.
Thank you. I'd just like to say your lectures have been wonderful, stunning. Just would like to thank you for that. And I can testify to going to Head Start in the 70s. You never left without a lecture or a book. I'd just like to ask you about Katherine Johnson. Amazing. Why there hasn't been a film or something about this woman. And you said that you've done a lot of work on her. Are you writing a book?
Okay, so it's very interesting. Katherine Johnson appeared, I saw the article by Mary White Ovington, and she appeared in my first book literally in one paragraph. I think I was writing about how we understand the distribution, like how people got books even. I have been really interested in the mobilization of print. And I had a student, Jane Carr, who I referred to, who wrote a really great article on Katherine Johnson, and she did much more work than I did. And I didn't even know when I wrote about her initially, and I really used her just to make a point. But I didn't even know her papers, Katherine Johnson's papers are at Harvard University. They're what used to be the Bunting Institute. They're Women and Gender Research Center. So when I was working on this, and when I saw that bookshelf just, when I saw that, I was like, I gotta write about that. I gotta think about that. And it reminded me immediately of Katherine Johnson and her 2-foot bookshelf. What we have of Katherine Johnson is she would work for the YWCA in Europe, mostly in France, during World War I, and she would establish libraries and things like that for soldiers. So she wrote one memoir of her time in the service. And she also has an unpublished autobiography from which I quoted. And it looks as if a family member has written also a book that I purchased in the last 6 months, a very recent book on her, but it's not scholarly in the same way it might be. So I think there's a real story there. And I also think, it's partly about book selling, and it's partly about mobility, there are all kinds of sort of U.S. studies that might be framed about the way women used mobility, not only cars, but also bicycles, to really change their lives and what was available to them. But but Katherine Johnson's one of those figures where her life is fascinating. And you look at her and you're like, oh my God, where did you were traveling around selling books out of your car. This tightly curated, she'd switch out books for different books of her 2-foot bookshelf. And she got the idea from something called the 5-foot bookshelf, which one of the former Harvard University professors had marketed as read 5 feet of books and you'll know everything you need to know. So she redesigned it as this 2-foot bookshelf. So there's so many interesting things about it, but she's definitely one of those people where you have these tantalizing materials more and more. I mean, I had never seen the flyer also until I'd gone back and started looking again. But you definitely, someone has to, be in it to try and figure out, like, to contextualize it. And how I would contextualize it, someone else will contextualize it completely differently, her story. But she's super, super interesting.
That was super interesting. And sadly, I think we are pretty much out of time. We could talk all night about this. Can we, one more time, say thank you to Elizabeth? Very, very
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth, just a few more words from me, because that, I think, has generated so many ideas in so many people in this room, and you've been so generous in sharing these thoughts. And I think for us, particularly in the UK, thank you, especially tonight, for reopening or maybe reopening some doors to our own history, the tale of Race Today or Grassroots, the shocking memory of bookshops being attacked in that way in this country. And as ever with these stories, it opens up doors that maybe we've forgotten through these questions. And I think everyone here will probably take different messages and bits of stimulus from this. I think I heard the phrase love, study, struggle, and going to the root. That's what happens here every day. People are constantly in this library trying to go deeper, go to the roots of things. And that was very moving. Others here have mentioned you're calling out the phrase from Rhoda Boateng about sitting with what maybe doesn't sit well with us. And that's a conversation we've had in other contexts here about particularly a library that tries to offer everything for study and even more connecting to other archives. And you've connected us to the archives we don't hold here. So I suppose my feeling coming out of this, once again with this lecture series, it takes us somewhere else every time, but I think what you have done is challenge us very politely, but to reframe the whole idea of the history of the book. And I'm so excited as we hit the 40th anniversary of this lecture series. I can see 40 more years where whole new topics are going to come out of some of the questions that you have raised tonight and some of the forgotten or semi-forgotten figures, and even what it means to talk about bibliography or books or indeed the culture of print. So thank you. This is a conversation that will continue. Some of it will continue here in January 25th. We have a session which co-organised by the British Library and the English faculty from University of Oxford called What is the Black Archive? So if you've been interested in some of this, please do come back here for that. And of course, the Panizzi lectures themselves continued, so a brief trailer for this time next year, where we will be welcoming Isabel Hofmeyr, Professor Emeritus at Wits University, and she will be talking to us, and I'm not going to go in detail about where this might take us, but books in the biosphere, print culture and the Anthropocene. So that's a year to have some anticipation about that. But for now, I just want once again to thank all of you for coming, all of you for listening and watching at home, and in particular, please, one more time, may I move a vote of thanks for Elizabeth McHenry. Thank you.